what would happen, and this is where the imagination comes in, what if we accepted your premise? What if we said that capitalism is, in fact, inherently racist? If we accept that premise, what I'm articulating in this book, which is a form of capitalism, what I'm calling capitalism, rooted in a deep spiritual tradition, rooted in a notion of transformation and cooperation and raising people up, then in fact what we're doing is imagining something that's not capitalism, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And that perhaps is a more interesting project, positioning this work as a reimagining of something that is different, precisely because all the critiques of capitalism are correct and should hold. And rather than be wedded and defensive and try to argue against them, let's instead say that any form of economic exchange rooted in spirituality, rooted in bringing people up, rooted in cooperation, resisting efficiency, resisting greed, is imagining something different. And then I thought, this is where the conversations with you are particularly helpful, because if it's an imaginative exercise, then all the insecurities artists might have about not being economists can fall by the wayside. Because if we're imagining together, then let's imagine together, and we're all equally, I'll say, worthy of being partners in this exploration. And that's exciting. That's exciting. You know?
I agree on so many fronts. And I will say that, you know, our conversations, over the course of our conversations, I have felt my own confidence to wade into this conversation grow and be nurtured and cultivated. And you have helped me understand how the skill set of the artist or of the person who spends their life, you know, nurturing an imagination can be maybe applicable at this juncture. And the other thing too that I thought, you know, that I reflected on after yesterday's conversation is that we did spend a great deal of time sort of articulating and naming and identifying for ourselves the failings or problems or shortcomings of capitalism, but that's not new. Like, and that's been done and done and done and done. And so I think where I thought we should start is with, okay, so then therefore what are the solutions? What are the solutions? And there was something you said towards the end of the conversation yesterday, which sort of blew my mind. And it was on the topic of vulnerability. And you were saying that cutting edge managerial theory right now is advocating for vulnerability. Is it in the workplace or in the corporate environment? Or I just really would love to learn more from you about that.
All of the above. I mean, what we've learned is that the sort of command and control leadership style is not as effective as a more vulnerable leadership style. And, you know, one of the main themes, if I could, you know, take one sentence out of the forthcoming book that I think really summarizes what I believe is a spiritual approach, a Jewish approach to business, is giving up on the idea of management and replacing it with transformational cooperation. And I'll tell you how that relates to this idea, you know, because if you're managing people, then the idea is that those beneath you are vulnerable and you're in control and you need to guide them in the appropriate direction. And that leads to exploitation and, in my mind, poor productivity, right, from even an economic standpoint. Whereas the alternative that I'm trying to propose, and which a lot of management researchers talk about right now, is if the leaders themselves were vulnerable and the leaders themselves recognize the contingency of their position and recognize, you know, if you will, that management should be a verb, right, and not a noun. In other words, management is okay as long as we're all engaging in management, versus manager as a noun, which is a hierarchical concept that maybe we need to, you know, get rid of. Folks are more productive, right? So there's a lot of articles right now in the business, in Harvard Business Review, on curiosity, on how we need workers to be more curious. And the only way to be curious is to feel empowered. And, you know, and from a leader standpoint, your coworkers will not be curious if you're not vulnerable. because they won't be comfortable asking questions and they won't be comfortable sharing feelings unless vulnerability is shared.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I know from, you know, the work that I've seen and done on the stage, the stories are the best and the most full and the most nuanced when that kind of, first of all, leadership is employed in the creative process. Mm-hmm. And when that kind of vulnerability is enabled. Mm-hmm. But those occasions, even in the arts world, are really, really few and far between. Like I can count on one hand the number of times that I've really been in that kind of an environment, artistically even. And I think, you know, probably from your perspective, I and we in the arts world are the kind of people who should be able to access that all the time and for whom that should be second nature. And so if even it is elusive there, how do we inject that into, you know, your world or the world at large, where the very whiff of that kind of vulnerability is so off-putting to people, and so I think actually ultimately menacing to people, that it's just like squished down immediately.
Yeah, I hear. And one of the ideas I argue for in look at that, in my book that I take from the Jewish tradition is this notion, it's the word that you saw for the first time when you were reading your chapter, chavrusa. The notion of
Say it again?
Chavrusa is how it's pronounced. Okay. It literally means friendship, but it's a style of learning based in pairs that encourages the building of vulnerability and removal of the hierarchy. I think that you're right. Being vulnerable is very tough, even in the most comforting and liberal environments. And I think being vulnerable on a team is tough. As the team grows, it becomes tougher. Mm-hmm. And so I think the solution, while not very deep, but certainly ancient, is you start with pairs of friendship. I mean, look at our own exchanges, right? Think of how two friends came together in that first call and it was still stiff, right? Mm-hmm. And now over time, after a couple, conversations, now we're starting to be more vulnerable and comfortable with each other. So, even on this micro level, right, it has to start with pairs and it has to move out from there. And I think that if we move away from, in management anyway, in the business world, right now, when you think of a team player is someone that shuts their mouth, right? A team player is someone who, hides their identity, goes in line. That's right. And if we move away from team players, which is being quiet, right? And instead moving towards expanding the pairs into authentic teams, where being part of a team means it's safe to be vulnerable, it's safe to be expressive, it's safe to be authentic.
You mentioned friendships, personal friendships, like even with your lover, even with in your most intimate primary relationships, actually being honest is hard. Yeah. It's like you have to peel back so much to actually come to the kernel truth, which often is like fear. Yeah. Which often is, I'm afraid that I'm unlovable. Like I think that's like the root fear for so many humans. And it's just, I mean, even when you feel so safe and supported and nurtured, it's still sometimes an ineffable thing. So I'm curious, because I feel like, whereas I come to this from like more of a felt, somatic, intuitive perspective, you probably have like research and data with more tried and tested means to achieve this goal.
Yeah. And it starts with, what we talked about a year ago when we met for lunch, which is forgiveness. And forgiveness, by the way, as we've also discussed, starts with forgiving yourself, So the step one in the forgiveness is forgiving yourself. Someone who I interviewed in my last book, Danny Lynn, who's a local Toronto artist and healer, she had this mind-blowing idea around what she calls the architects of survival, which is, at varying times in our history, we need to become certain people in order to survive. And there shouldn't be any shame in that because survival is messy. And the forgiveness piece comes in when you say, I'm going to let that person go who I was because I don't need to be that person anymore. And I'm not going to judge myself for being that person, right? So it's two steps. It's saying, I was that person and I forgive myself for being that person because I needed to be that person. But, and this is where Danny blows my mind, because her stories of trauma are beyond anything that, you know, I encourage all you to read the book and seek her out. She's an amazing woman. But, you know, you forgive yourself and you dismiss your architects of survival, and then you can be in the moment. And then we come to the pods, right? That's where forgiveness comes in as well, because by forgiveness, we start in the present. Yes. And, you know, one of the things we talk about, you and I, in our conversation that's going to be in the Connected Capitalism book, is that there are different types of forgiveness. So, you know, forgiveness might be pragmatic. It might be, I haven't forgotten what you've done, but, you know, we're working together, so I'm going to forgive to be here now, right? There's a more noble, if you will, wipe the slate clean type of forgiveness. There's forgiveness motivated by religious belief. There's psychological forgiveness, right? That says, you know, if I don't forgive, I won't be healthy because anger is unhealthy. But you forgive and then you're in the moment. Now, do all chavrusas work? No, not necessarily, right? You know, it's special and beautiful when two people can come together, forgive themselves, forgive each other, be vulnerable, and try to create something. That's rare. But you ask a practical, you know, first step. That's what it is. And where I'll push a little bit on what you said, right? That's different even than the forgiveness and the vulnerability you have with your lover, because that's a long-term project that you know, hopefully, you're committed to. So it's almost easier in the context of your lover to eventually get there. Whereas when you think about pragmatic, you know, idea of work, right? What's your tie to some of these folks? Minimal, right? Other than a desire to get a project done. And it's much harder to come into that context. But that, and this is the theme of my forthcoming book, is what makes work spiritual then, right? Then you've moved it from being an act about making money and saying it's a spiritual journey. It's a spiritual journey because my primary goal is to connect with other human beings, to transform them and to transform me. Yeah, making money will be nice and probably necessary, but it's spiritual because it's about meaning within the relationship. It's about connection between people, and it's about wonder about the possibilities of life and where things can go. And, you know, as I say it, I know people might listen to this and roll their eyes, and to those eye rollers, I'll say, sorry, but that's the truth. You know, that's where the work has to be done. And a lot of us have, you know, have been socialized into thinking that vulnerability is weakness, or self-love and forgiveness is weakness. And step one is getting rid of that view.